My 34th birthday was supposed to be a peaceful brunch in a crowded Charleston cafe. Instead, mid-toast, my mother leaned over and whispered to my brother to change the keypad at my house and grab a blue lockbox. 17 minutes later, he returned pale and shaking. I did not panic. I did not cry. I just smiled. In that moment, I knew they were no longer just controlling me. They were desperately hiding a crime. My name is Reagan Bennett, and on the day I turned 34, I sat at a corner table of a sun-drenched cafe in the historic district of Charleston, watching my family perform their favorite play. I work as a title risk investigator at Harborline Due Diligence Group. My daily life revolves around unearthing the buried rot beneath pristine legal facades. I spend my hours hunting for forged signatures, hidden liens, phantom corporate entities, and the quiet, desperate ways people try to steal things that do not belong to them. It is an occupational hazard that I cannot simply turn off this instinct when I'm off the clock. Therefore, when I arrived for my own birthday brunch, I did not bring the naive joy of a daughter celebrating another year of life. I brought the measured, clinical observation of an auditor stepping into a room full of highly motivated suspects. The cafe was upscale but suffocatingly cozy, the kind of establishment where the exposed brick walls dripped with manufactured Southern charm and the mimosas cost $20 a glass. Outside, the Charleston heat was already a heavy, humid weight pressing against the tall windows. But inside, the air conditioning was a frigid, relentless blast. The clinking of heavy silver on porcelain and the low hum of wealthy patrons complaining about their contractors created a perfect curtain of white noise. It was the ideal setting for my family. They have always possessed a distinct, predatory talent for camouflaging their covert control sessions as harmless celebrations. My mother, Celeste Bennett, sat across from me, a vision wrapped in expensive linen and vintage pearls. She was behaving with a sweetness that bordered on toxic. Every compliment she offered had a rusted hook hidden inside it. She praised my career progression, while subtly lamenting that I worked entirely too hard to ever find a husband. She complimented my dress while physically reaching across the table to adjust the collar to her liking, a tactile reminder that she still viewed my physical form as an extension of her own property. Beside her sat my father, Warren Bennett. He was a man composed entirely of shadows, tailored suits, and silence. He did not engage in the petty bickering or the passive-aggressive jabs. He simply watched. He nursed a glass of iced tea, his cold eyes darting between me and the exit, calculating variables only he could see in his head. He has always preferred to let my mother be the loud, distracting storm while he operates in the quiet, profitable devastation of the aftermath. And then there was my older brother, Mason. Mason Bennett was currently bouncing his leg under the heavy oak table with the frantic, irregular rhythm of a man waiting for a delayed flight out of a war zone. He was sweating despite the chill of the dining room. Every 2 minutes, his eyes flicked down to the glowing screen of his phone resting on his thigh. He was not present in the conversation. He was a tightly coiled spring, waiting for a signal. The turning point of my life arrived with the dessert course. A waiter in a crisp white apron approached our table carrying a small, elegant pastry topped with a single lit candle. The surrounding tables paused their conversations to offer polite, sympathetic smiles. My mother clapped her hands together in a grotesque display of manufactured delight. The waiter began to cut the cake, and the noise level at our table rose with the scraping of dessert plates and the shifting of wooden chairs. It was in that precise pocket of distraction, amid the sudden flurry of movement and the waiter asking who wanted decaf coffee, that my mother leaned slightly to her left. She did not look at Mason. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the silver knife slicing through the vanilla buttercream, but I saw the subtle shift of her jaw. And because I had spent 3 decades learning to read the silent, venomous language of this family, I tuned out the waiter and focused entirely on the frequency of her voice beneath the clatter. She whispered the words. They were soft, hurried, and chillingly pragmatic. While everyone is here, go and change the keypad at Reagan's carriage house. Bring me the blue lockbox before she gets back. A normal person might have dropped their fork. A normal person might have demanded an explanation right then and there, caused a public scene, or stormed out in tears. I did none of those things. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my ice water. I felt my heart rate steady into a slow, powerful rhythm. The ice clinked against the crystal glass, loud and clear in my own ears. Mason did not hesitate. He muttered a pathetic, poorly rehearsed excuse about needing to take an urgent work call, stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floorboards, and slipped out the side door of the cafe. He moved with the desperate speed of a man who was terrified of failing our mother. I sat there. I ate my cake. It tasted like ash and refined sugar. I smiled politely at my father. I thanked my mother for organizing such a beautiful brunch. I acted exactly like the obedient, oblivious, easy-to-manage daughter they had spent a lifetime cultivating. But beneath my skin, the investigator had taken the wheel. I began counting the minutes. I mapped out the driving distance from the cafe to my carriage house. It was a 10-minute drive in typical weekend traffic. Give him 3 minutes to attempt the door. 10 minutes back. The nearly 20 minutes that followed were a masterclass in psychological endurance. Celeste filled the void left by Mason with a steady stream of mundane, venomous gossip about the neighbors and her country club rivals. Warren continued his silent vigil, his eyes occasionally flicking to his watch. I contributed just enough to the conversation to maintain the fragile illusion of normalcy. Every second that ticked by was a heavy drop of water in a metal bucket. I was not afraid. I was electrified. I knew exactly what was in the blue lockbox. They thought they knew what was in the blue lockbox. They believed they were executing a flawless, preemptive strike while I was neutralized by mimosas and polite company. They were incredibly, fatally wrong. At exactly 19 minutes after he left, the heavy wooden door of the cafe swung open. Mason walked back in. The change in his physical appearance was startling. When he left, he was merely anxious. Now he was the color of wet concrete. His broad shoulders were slumped. His breathing was a shallow wheeze, and his hands were trembling so violently he had to shove them deep into his trouser pockets to hide the shaking from the rest of the room. He practically collapsed into his empty chair. He did not look at me. He leaned directly across the table toward my mother, abandoning all pretense of subtlety or dining etiquette. His voice was a strained, frantic rasp that cut through the background music. The code does not work. The entire keypad has been replaced. And that is not all. He swallowed hard, his eyes wide with a very specific, cornered animal panic. There is a sealed legal notice taped directly to the front door, and Mrs. Gable from next door was standing on her porch with her phone out. She said she already called the police because she caught a strange locksmith trying to drill the deadbolt. She chased him off before I even pulled into the driveway. The silence that fell over our side of the table was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a violent car crash, in that split second before the screaming begins. My father stopped chewing. His hand froze halfway to his glass of tea. The calculating, indifferent mask on his face cracked cleanly down the middle, revealing a flash of genuine, unadulterated shock. But it was my mother who delivered the final, defining blow of the afternoon. She did not gasp. She did not ask if the police were currently at my house. She did not look at me with maternal concern and ask if I felt safe knowing a strange man had just tried to break into my home. She did not care about the locksmith, the neighbor, or my security. Her eyes narrowed into sharp, cruel slits. She grabbed Mason by the wrist, her manicured nails digging fiercely into his skin. "Is the box still there?" she demanded. That single question was the master key that unlocked the final door in my mind. It severed the last, fraying thread of familial obligation I had been foolishly clinging to. They were not trying to teach me a lesson about independence. They were not trying to punish me for buying my own property. They were hunting for hard evidence. And the sheer, naked panic in my mother's voice confirmed the massive magnitude of their guilt. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw my drink in her face. I did not give them the deep satisfaction of witnessing an emotional breakdown. I slowly wiped my mouth with my linen napkin and placed it neatly beside my half-eaten slice of cake. I reached into my leather purse, pulled out my wallet, and extracted a sleek credit card. I placed it squarely in the center of the table, right on top of the black leather billfold the waiter had left earlier. I stood up. Celeste finally looked at me, her expression a chaotic, crumbling mix of confusion and rising terror. Warren stared at my credit card like it was a live explosive device. Mason was still shaking, his eyes darting wildly between the three of us. I looked down at them, the architects of my heavily managed, perpetually undermined existence. I offered them one single, razor-sharp smile. It was not a smile of joy, nor was it a smile of forgiveness. It was the smile of an executioner acknowledging the condemned. I turned my back on my family and walked toward the exit. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the blistering, blinding Charleston heat. The humidity wrapped around me instantly, a suffocating blanket, but I did not feel the warmth. As I walked down the cobblestone street, my heels clicking a steady, martial rhythm against the pavement, a deep, pervasive cold settled permanently into my bones. The game of pretending was over. The era of being the compliant daughter was dead. The war had officially begun. The drive away from the historic district felt like crossing a heavily fortified border. I navigated my sedan through the narrow, winding streets of Charleston, leaving the manicured facades and polite society behind. My destination was a secluded carriage house tucked away on a dead-end street, lined with ancient oak trees. Their thick branches dripped with heavy curtains of Spanish moss, casting long, fractured shadows across the pavement. I had purchased this property 2 years ago using my own savings, a down payment built from relentless overtime and sheer stubbornness. Not a single cent of Bennett family money had ever touched its foundation. That fact had always been a quiet source of pride, but today it was my absolute armor. When I turned the corner onto my street, the pulsing blue and red lights of a county sheriff cruiser washed over the Spanish moss. The cruiser was parked at an awkward angle, blocking the driveway of my carriage house. Standing on the sidewalk, gesturing emphatically with a silver-handled walking cane, was Mrs. Gable, my 72-year-old neighbor. Beside her stood a tall, broad-shouldered deputy taking notes on a small pad. I parked against the curb, killed the engine, and stepped out into the humid afternoon air. The moment Mrs. Gable saw me, she hurried over, her floral dress billowing. She did not bother with pleasantries. She launched directly into a play-by-action account. She told me she had been watering her hydrangeas when a white utility van pulled up. A man in a company polo shirt got out, carrying a heavy tool bag, followed closely by another man holding a manila folder. They marched straight to my front door. Mrs. Gable, possessing the sharp, uncompromising vigilance of a widow with entirely too much free time, had marched right across the lawn and demanded to know their business. The man with the folder had spoken fast, flashing a piece of paper and claiming he was an authorized property manager executing a legal lock change due to a sudden familial emergency. He said he had a power of attorney. Mrs. Gable had not bought a single word of it. She told them she knew the owner, knew there was no property manager, and informed them that if they touched the deadbolt, she would have the police on site in exactly 3 minutes. The locksmith, clearly spooked by the threat of law enforcement, had packed up his drill and bolted. The man with the folder had cursed, shoved the paperwork into his jacket, and fled on foot toward the main avenue just before my brother pulled up in his car to check on the progress. The deputy, a man whose brass name tag read Miller, tipped his hat to me and stepped forward. He corroborated her story, adding that he had run the license plate of the van, which belonged to a legitimate local business that claimed they were hired over the phone for an emergency lockout. Then, Deputy Miller asked if I wanted to walk through the house to check if anyone had actually managed to gain entry before Mrs. Gable intervened. I unlocked the heavy oak door with my original key. The air inside was stale and perfectly still. I walked through the small foyer, my eyes scanning the perimeter. There was no shattered glass, no muddy footprints on the hardwood floors, no overturned furniture. The living room looked exactly as I had left it that morning. The television was untouched. My jewelry box sat undisturbed on the bedroom dresser. It was not a random burglary, it was a surgical strike. I walked down the short hallway and pushed open the door to my home office. The chill that had settled in my bones at the cafe suddenly deepened, freezing the blood in my veins. Someone had been inside. The locksmith outside was just the second wave, the brute force meant to secure the perimeter after the initial infiltration. The first operative had clearly possessed a cloned key or a high-end lockpicking kit, and they had bypassed the front door without leaving a scratch. The violation of my sanctuary was horrifyingly precise. The intruder had not touched the expensive camera equipment sitting on the bookshelf. They had completely ignored the emergency stash of $500 in cold, hard cash tucked under a heavy paperweight. They did not care about valuables. They only cared about leverage. The bottom two drawers of my heavy mahogany filing cabinet were pulled open. The hanging folders were meticulously sifted through, not ripped or thrown, but examined and discarded. My desk chair was pushed back at an odd angle. The small concealed compartment at the back of the bottom desk drawer was wide open. That compartment was the exact, highly specific location where I used to keep a small, fireproof blue lockbox. I stood in the center of the room, analyzing the empty space. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and they knew precisely where to look. This meant they had been watching me, perhaps for weeks, waiting for a window of opportunity. The birthday brunch was not just a distraction, it was the alibi. Deputy Miller cleared his throat from the doorway. He held up a clear plastic evidence bag containing a crumpled piece of paper. He explained that one of the responding officers had found it discarded in the storm drain at the end of the street, likely tossed by the fleeing man with the folder. It was a copy of the supposed power of attorney. He handed it to me. As a title risk investigator, I have spent a decade staring at fraudulent documents. I can spot a forged warranty deed from 10 feet away. Looking at the paper in the plastic bag, I felt a grim professional validation. It was a remarkably bold piece of fiction. The document purported to grant my father complete, unrestricted legal authority over my residence, my financial accounts, and my personal property. Citing a fabricated sudden medical incapacitation, I studied the ink. The signature above my printed name was a decent attempt, but it was structurally flawed. The loops were too tight, the pressure too even. It lacked the natural, fluid momentum of my actual handwriting. It was a tracing job, likely lifted from an old tax return, but the most glaring error was the digital footprint. In the bottom corner sat an electronic notary seal. To the untrained eye, it looked official, complete with a registration number and a barcode. However, my eyes automatically scanned the microscopic audit trail data printed beneath the seal. The IP address linked to the e-notary session was not local to my home or my office. It was a static address. I recognized the numerical string instantly. It was the dedicated server block used by the executive suites at Marsh Lantern Development, my father's shadow company. I handed the bag back to the deputy. I thanked him and Mrs. Gable for their vigilance, assuring them I would be pressing full charges once I gathered my own security footage. I waited until the cruiser pulled away and Mrs. Gable retreated to her hydrangeas before I closed the front door and engaged the deadbolt. I was finally alone in the suffocating silence of my violated house. My family had not acted out of sudden, irrational anger. They had drafted a fraudulent legal instrument, forged my signature, falsified a notary seal, and hired operatives to physically breach my home. They wanted to strip me of my legal agency to retrieve the one thing that could destroy them. I walked back into the office and looked at the empty desk drawer. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. They had orchestrated a flawless raid, but their intelligence was critically outdated. The blue lockbox had not been inside this house for exactly 3 weeks. The moment I realized what I had found in my grandmother's storage unit, I knew the carriage house was compromised. I had driven to a secure bank vault 2 towns over, rented a safe deposit box under a newly formed corporate shell, and buried the original documents where my father's reach could never extend. A verified, digitally encrypted legal copy was already sitting in the secured servers of my attorney. My family had just committed multiple state and federal felonies to break into an empty vault. I did not collapse. I did not shed a single tear. Panic is a luxury for people who do not know how to fight back. I sat down on the hardwood floor, right in the middle of the ransacked office, and pulled my laptop from my leather tote bag. I flipped the screen open. The glow illuminated the dark corners of the room. My fingers hit the keyboard with the speed and precision of a concert pianist. Within 4 minutes, I had accessed the portals for all 3 major credit bureaus. I initiated a hard, unconditional freeze on my Social Security number. I placed a permanent, high-level fraud alert on my identity, ensuring no loans, deeds, or lines of credit could be opened or altered without direct, verbal biometric verification. Then, I opened a blank spreadsheet. The fear was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating hyperfocus. They wanted to use the law as a weapon against me. They had forgotten that I was the one who mapped the battlefield for a living. I cracked my knuckles and began to meticulously reconstruct the digital, financial, and legal anatomy of their crimes. The hunt had officially started. The revelation that broke my family apart did not begin with a dramatic confrontation or a tearful confession. It began exactly 6 months ago, in the dim, stale air of a rented climate-controlled storage unit on the industrial edge of the city. My grandmother, June Holloway Bennett, had been dead for 4 years. She was a woman of sharp edges and unspoken observations, someone who watched the room rather than holding court in it. When she passed away, my parents handled the estate with an aggressive, almost frantic speed. They packed away her entire life into cardboard boxes, shoved them into a concrete locker, and handed me the padlock key with a heavy sigh, claiming it was too painful for them to sort through the remnants of a life that ended in such tragic ruin. Growing up, the narrative surrounding my grandmother's final years was a carefully constructed tragedy. Celeste and Warren repeated the story so often it became the foundational myth of our family. We were told that June had lost her mind in her twilight years, made terrible investments, and died drowning in insurmountable debt. We were told that the ancestral properties, an entire block of beautiful, crumbling, historic row houses, had to be liquidated in a desperate fire sale just to satisfy her creditors and save the Bennett name from public disgrace. I absorbed this story as absolute truth. It was the reason we were taught to be frugal, the reason my parents always claimed money was tight, and the reason I was expected to ask for nothing. But 6 months ago, kneeling on the concrete floor of unit number 412, I opened a rusted tin box decorated with faded painted daisies. A strip of masking tape across the lid read, "June's Cookie Recipes," in her distinctive, jagged handwriting. I expected to find index cards stained with vanilla extract and butter. Instead, I pulled out a stack of tightly bound, impeccably preserved documents that rewrote my entire existence. There was a handwritten codicil to her final will, notarized and dated just 3 weeks before her sudden stroke. Beneath it sat 2 heavy ledger books, logging decades of rent collection, a stack of formal meeting minutes for a corporate entity, and a chunky, outdated flash drive bearing the logo of the old family accountant who had conveniently retired right after her funeral. The air in the storage unit felt suddenly thin. I unfolded the codicil, the heavy parchment crackling in the quiet space. The legal phrasing was dense, but the core directive was crystal clear. June had not died in debt. She had not lost her mind. In fact, she had seen exactly what was happening around her. She had realized that my mother and father were quietly bleeding the family company dry, treating the corporate accounts like a personal slush fund for country club dues and luxury car leases. To protect the core assets, June had executed a legally binding transfer. She left exactly 51% of the controlling interest in Bennett Rowe Holdings, limited liability company, directly to me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the words again. Bennett Rowe Holdings was not a liquidated, defunct tragedy. It was a fully operational, highly lucrative entity. According to the ledgers and the corporate minutes stuffed in that tin, the company had never sold the ancestral row houses. It still held the free and clear deeds to 3 massive historic properties. And those properties were not worthless ruins. They sat directly on the city's newly approved commercial redevelopment corridor, making the land alone worth millions of dollars. I sat there in the dust, the tin box resting on my knees, as a tidal wave of realization crashed over me. By law, I should have been notified by the probate attorney the day after the funeral. I should have been handed the operating agreement and assumed my rightful place as the majority stakeholder, but my name had simply vanished. It had been intentionally and illegally scrubbed from the Secretary of State's annual filings. As I dug deeper into the ledgers and the printed emails from the flash drive, the financial betrayal began to sting. But it was the emotional betrayal that hollowed me out. The money was just math. The cruelty was the design. A familiar, agonizing pattern from my childhood suddenly came into sharp, horrifying focus. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent working double shifts at a terrible diner during college just to afford my tuition, while my parents claimed they could not spare a single dollar because they were still paying off my grandmother's supposed debts. I remembered the crippling anxiety of taking out a high-interest mortgage to buy my small carriage house, eating rice and beans for months to scrape together the down payment. All the while, my older brother Mason floated through life on a golden cushion. When he dropped out of his master's program, the family paid his rent. When he totaled his sports car, a new one appeared in the driveway. When his supposed startup ventures collapsed one after another, there was always a miraculous, untraceable influx of cash from our parents to bail him out and keep his reputation spotless. I used to think they just loved him more. I used to agonize over what I was doing wrong, why I was always held to an impossible standard of independence while he was endlessly coddled. Sitting in the dim light of the storage unit, holding the proof of my stolen inheritance, I finally understood the truth. It was never just simple favoritism. They had not merely preferred my brother, they had engineered my struggle. They built an entire, elaborate system of lies specifically designed to keep me weak, financially dependent, and perpetually exhausted. If I was always fighting just to keep my head above water, paying my own bills and working 2 jobs, I would never have the time, the resources, or the audacity to question the family finances. They weaponized my own work ethic against me to keep me blind to my own power. The sheer scale of the gaslighting was breathtaking. They had looked me in the eye at every Thanksgiving dinner, every graduation, every birthday, and played the role of the struggling, noble parents, all while quietly managing a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio that legally belonged to me. A weaker person might have grabbed the tin box, driven straight to my parents' immaculate suburban home, and screamed until her throat bled. The urge to confront them, to throw the ledgers on their expensive dining table and watch their faces crumble, was a physical ache in my chest. But as the initial shock subsided, the cold, clinical mind of the title investigator took over. Screaming is what victims do when they have no other leverage. Anger is a fleeting, messy emotion that gives the enemy time to prepare a defense. If I walked in there with tears and accusations, Warren would calmly call his lawyers, Celeste would play the victim, and the documents would somehow disappear in a sudden, tragic house fire. I could not afford to fight them with emotion. I had to fight them with structure. I carefully placed the codicil, the ledgers, and the flash drive back into the floral tin box. I closed the lid, locked the storage unit, and drove home in complete silence. That night, I did not sleep. I set up a high-resolution scanner on my kitchen counter. Page by page, hour after hour, I began to silently digitize the true history of my family. I backed up the files to 3 separate, encrypted cloud servers. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse and began quietly cross-referencing the property tax records, pulling every fraudulent deed and forged signature they had filed over the last 4 years. I decided right then that I would not say a single word. I would continue to play the role of the independent, slightly estranged daughter. I would attend their dinners, smile at their passive-aggressive insults, and let them believe their perfect machine was running smoothly. I would gather every single piece of ammunition available, build an impenetrable fortress of legal evidence, and simply wait. I would wait for the exact moment they realized the safety net they had stolen from me was about to become the snare that would hang them all. The county recorder's database is a graveyard of bad decisions and broken promises. But if you know exactly where to dig, it always tells the absolute truth. Sitting at my dining table, bathed in the harsh, clinical blue light of my dual monitors, I felt less like a daughter and more like a forensic pathologist standing over a diseased corpse, slicing through layers of deceit with a scalpel made of raw data. I began pulling the chain of title for the 3 historic properties owned by Bennett Rowe Holdings. The original deeds were intact, safely registered in the county archives, but the encumbrances attached to them were staggering. The properties had not just been sitting dormant while my parents played the role of the struggling stewards. They had been aggressively and systematically leveraged. Over the past 4 years, my family had taken out massive commercial mortgages, refinanced those mortgages when the rates dropped, and pulled out every available drop of equity. To execute these high-value loans, the banks required a corporate resolution authorizing the debt, signed by the majority stakeholder of the limited liability company. They needed my authorization. I leaned closer to the screen, staring at the high-resolution scans of the commercial loan agreements. There, at the bottom of every single member resolution, was my full legal name, executed via a popular electronic signature platform. The immediate question was not how they did it, but where the bleeding led. I accessed the disbursement ledgers attached to the mortgage filings. A massive, gaping artery of the loan proceeds was routed directly into the operating accounts of Willow Tree Studio. On paper, this was my mother's boutique interior design firm. The invoices submitted to the bank were meticulously coded as historic preservation costs, architectural salvage acquisition, and structural masonry repair. I cross-referenced the vendor tax identification numbers against the state registry. There was no masonry repair. There was no architectural salvage. The money flowed out of the corporate account just as fast as it came in, used exclusively to pay off high-limit luxury charge cards, fund extravagant overseas vacations, and cover the enormous overhead of a socialite lifestyle they could not legitimately afford on their own merit. Celeste was literally using the ancestral dirt beneath our feet to finance her wardrobe and maintain her pristine country club status, masking her embezzlement behind the noble facade of preserving city history. The second financial artery bled in a completely different direction, flowing into a corporate entity called Marsh Lantern Development. This was my father's shadow enterprise. The disbursements routed here were colder, far more calculated, and deeply sinister. The ledgers showed hundreds of thousands of dollars paid out as vague consulting fees, heavy retainers for local zoning lobbyists, and a massive, uncharacterized escrow deposit. Warren was not buying designer shoes or luxury vehicles. He was buying political influence and paving the invisible roads for something massive. And then there was Mason. My golden brother's signature was plastered across every single municipal permit, every environmental hazard waiver, and every subcontractor agreement filed with the city. His official title on the paperwork was Lead Site Manager. At first glance, it looked like nepotism, a father giving his son a fancy title and a paycheck. But as I traced the liability clauses buried in the fine print of the subcontractor agreements, a sickening realization washed over me. Mason was not managing a single thing. He was a human shield. Warren had intentionally structured the corporate hierarchy so that all the physical and operational liability fell squarely on Mason's shoulders. If a historic retaining wall collapsed and crushed a pedestrian, if an uninsured worker was injured on the site, or if the city environmental inspectors found a severe toxic violation, the fines and the criminal negligence charges would bypass my parents completely. The legal blowback would land directly and exclusively on their favorite son. They were treating Mason like a disposable asset, a convenient scapegoat meant to absorb the risk while they absorbed the capital. I needed irrefutable proof that I had never signed the loan documents authorizing this financial slaughter. I ran a forensic trace on the electronic signature certificates attached to the fraudulent deeds. Every digital signature leaves a permanent metadata trail, a combination of timestamps, browser data, and Internet Protocol addresses. I exported the audit logs for the last 12 forged resolutions. I did not need a team of cybersecurity experts to see the glaring pattern. Every single time my digital signature was applied to a multi-million-dollar commercial loan, the Internet Protocol address was identical. I ran a geolocation trace on the static address. It did not ping to my carriage house. It did not ping to my secure office at Harborline Due Diligence Group. The numerical address mapped directly to a localized commercial fiber node, servicing the exact geographic coordinates of my father's private executive suite at Marsh Lantern Development. He had not even bothered to employ a sophisticated proxy or cover his digital tracks. He was so arrogant, so entirely convinced of my engineered ignorance, that he had simply sat at his heavy mahogany desk, logged into a fraudulent notary portal, and systematically mortgaged my inheritance with the casual click of a mouse. But the biggest shock, the discovery that finally made my blood run entirely cold, was hidden deep within the escrow ledgers of Marsh Lantern. I found a wire transfer reference number for an earnest money deposit that did not align with any known preservation project or lobbying effort. I plugged the reference number into the county's pending transaction queue, bypassing the public interface to look at the raw, unprocessed filings. The screen refreshed, and all the air left my lungs. It was an unrecorded option contract. Warren was not just bleeding the properties dry, he was preparing to kill the host entirely. He had brokered a massive, off-market deal to sell the most valuable corner lot of the Bennett Row portfolio to an aggressive, out-of-state commercial developer. He was preparing to bulldoze the history he claimed to be saving. The closing date was set for just 6 weeks away. He was racing to liquidate the primary asset and turn the dirt into untraceable cash before I ever realized I owned the ground he was standing on. The true paralyzing horror of the option contract was buried in the liability structure of the sale. If that transaction closed, the corporate indemnification clauses were specifically designed to trigger a cascading release of liability for the minority partners, my parents. But as the forged signatory on the consent resolutions, I would be legally cemented as the primary architect of the entire 4-year fraud scheme. If the state tax board or the federal banking regulators ever audited the sale after the fact, Warren and Celeste would walk away with millions in clean cash, and I would be left holding a massive, federally indicted bag. They were not just stealing my legacy, they were meticulously, patiently framing me for the theft. I compiled everything: the forged warranty deeds, the fake e-notary logs, the Internet Protocol address traces, the fraudulent vendor invoices from my mother's studio, and the pending option contract. I organized the raw data into a brutal, undeniable timeline of financial crimes. I encrypted the entire file directory, password-protected the server link, and drafted a brief, highly technical email devoid of any emotional language. I sent the digital package to Talia Mercer. Talia was a senior partner at a boutique commercial litigation firm downtown. She was a woman who possessed the warmth of a glacier and the tactical precision of a military drone strike. She did not handle emotional family disputes or messy divorces. She handled corporate executions and hostile takeovers. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the quiet house. Exactly 32 minutes later, my phone vibrated against the table with a single new email notification. I opened the message. Talia had not bothered with a polite greeting, a sympathetic opening, or a professional sign-off. Her response consisted of exactly 2 sentences. This is no longer a family dispute. This is organized title fraud. The psychological warfare commenced exactly 2 hours after I walked out of that air-conditioned dining room and stepped into the suffocating coastal heat. I had barely parked my car in the driveway of my carriage house when my cell phone began a relentless, rhythmic vibration against the center console. It did not stop for 3 solid days. My mother launched the first volley. By Monday morning, she had sent 47 text messages. Not a single one of those messages inquired if I was safe, or if the police had caught the man trying to drill through my front door. Instead, my screen was flooded with the soft, suffocating poison of her manufactured maternal concern. Darling, please do not make a mountain out of a molehill. The first message read, "We were just trying to secure some old family papers that belong to your father. You are taking this completely out of context." An hour later, another arrived. "Sweetheart, please call your mother. You are acting entirely irrational. Let us just sit down and clear up this silly misunderstanding like adults. Family is everything." The gaslighting was so perfectly executed, it belonged in a clinical textbook. She was actively attempting to frame a coordinated, illegal break-in as a simple, clumsy mistake born out of familial love. She wanted me to doubt my own eyes, to believe that my outrage over a forged power of attorney was actually a symptom of my own emotional instability. My father chose a completely different weapon. At 8 o'clock on Monday morning, an email landed in my primary inbox. The subject line was blank. The tone of the message was perfectly sterile, deliberately devoid of the chaotic, desperate emotion my mother was currently weaponizing. It read like a corporate cease and desist order. He wrote that my recent unauthorized interference with the corporate archives of the family business was deeply concerning to his partners. He suggested, employing heavy, unmistakable legal phrasing, that if I continued to disrupt their daily operations or access confidential company data, he would be forced to seek immediate injunctive relief. He explicitly threatened to file a civil suit against me for tortious interference with a business advantage, but the final sentence was the one that truly showcased his depravity. He added a sickening clause stating he would not hesitate to pursue punitive damages for the severe emotional distress and financial elder abuse I was supposedly inflicting on him and my mother. Elder abuse. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the accusation forced a harsh, bitter laugh from my throat. He was actively laying the groundwork to portray himself as a frail, defenseless senior citizen being relentlessly terrorized by a predatory, money-hungry child. Mason called me precisely at noon. I let it ring through to voicemail twice before finally answering on the third attempt. His voice was loud, abrasive, and laced with the specific, fragile arrogance of a man who suddenly realizes he is standing on a landmine. "You are embarrassing the entire family," he snapped the absolute second the line connected. "Mom is crying in the kitchen. Dad is having heart palpitations. Are you happy now? What is wrong with you?" He paused, his breathing heavy into the microphone, and the false bravado slipped just enough to reveal the desperate fishing expedition underneath. "Look, just tell me what you gave those lawyers. If you handed over the old ledgers, you are going to ruin everything for all of us. Just tell me what you did so we can fix it." I did not raise my voice. I did not offer him the satisfaction of a screaming match. I did not justify my existence or explain my actions. I simply pressed the red icon on my screen and terminated the call. Arguing with them was exactly what they wanted. It would drag me down into the emotional mud where they controlled the narrative and the rules of engagement. So, I responded in the only language my father truly understood and respected. I drove straight to Talia Mercer's office. I did not ask for a negotiation strategy. I instructed her to immediately file a lis pendens on all 3 historic properties currently held by the holding company. For those outside the ruthless arena of commercial real estate, a lis pendens is a formal, public notice of pending legal action recorded directly against the title of a property. It is the absolute nuclear option of ownership disputes. It acts as a massive, glaring warning sign to any potential buyer, commercial lender, or title insurance underwriter that the ownership of the land is heavily contested and currently subject to a lawsuit. By filing that single document with the county clerk, I effectively paralyzed my father's secret, multi-million-dollar out-of-state sale. No sane developer would touch that dirt now. No bank would underwrite the transaction. I froze his shadowy empire right at the absolute peak of its vulnerability, cutting off his escape route just 6 weeks before he planned to cash out. The retaliation for freezing his assets was swift, vicious, and entirely social. By Wednesday afternoon, the extended family network was buzzing with a highly coordinated smear campaign. My parents systematically reached out to every aunt, every uncle, and every longtime family friend in the coastal area. They spun a tragic, deeply convincing narrative of a daughter who had simply lost her grip on reality due to the stress of her job. I was painted as unstable, hopelessly obsessed with meaningless administrative paperwork, and suffering from severe paranoid delusions about a grand, non-existent conspiracy to steal my inheritance. The deepest, most agonizing cut came on Thursday evening when my Aunt Clara called. I had always trusted her. She possessed a warm, sensible nature that my mother severely lacked, and I foolishly hoped she might offer a shred of objective support. But within 2 minutes of our conversation, the trap my mother had set finally snapped shut. "Honey, you need to calm down and listen to your parents," Clara cooed softly through the speaker, her voice dripping with misplaced pity. "Your mother has been so terribly worried about your mental balance. She told me months ago, way back at Thanksgiving, that you were acting aggressively about the family estate and exhibiting alarming signs of severe financial paranoia. Please get some professional help before you do something you regret." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. Thanksgiving was over 8 months ago. My mother had not been reacting to the events of my birthday brunch. She had been preemptively seeding the ground for my destruction for nearly a year. She knew the day would eventually come when I found the truth buried in those documents. So she meticulously built a psychological quarantine zone around me. If I ever spoke out, the entire family had already been programmed to view my hard evidence as the frantic, sad ravings of a mentally unwell child. The betrayal felt like a physical knife twisting slowly under my ribs. The urge to act impulsively, to call Clara back and read her the forged warranty deeds line by line until she choked on her own apologies, was almost overwhelming. But I swallowed the pain, forcing it down into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. Impulsive emotion is the absolute enemy of a bulletproof legal strategy. In this specific type of warfare, anger only serves to contaminate the evidence. Instead of lashing out, I opened a new, encrypted folder on my secure hard drive. I saved the audio recording of Mason's threatening phone call. I captured high-resolution screenshots of all 47 of my mother's manipulative text messages, ensuring the timestamps were clearly visible. I archived my father's extortionate email alongside the forged documents. I was not a victim crying in the dark. I was a meticulous archivist compiling the definitive historical record of their ruin. Late Friday afternoon, my secure office phone line rang. It was Talia. Her voice was flat, carrying the grim, heavy weight of a general analyzing a suddenly shifting battlefield. "They just escalated the timeline," she stated plainly, skipping any pleasantries. "My contacts at the local media syndicate just tipped me off. Your father did not just hire a defense attorney to fight the Lis Pendens. He retained a high-end crisis management and public relations firm out of Atlanta. They are currently drafting press releases and reaching out to friendly local journalists." She paused, letting the silence emphasize the gravity of the situation. "They are preparing to launch a preemptive strike in the local business journals. They are going to frame this entire situation as a tragic case of elder abuse, a rogue, unstable daughter trying to bankrupt her elderly parents and destroy a cherished family legacy. They are going to try and ruin your professional credibility before we even get to a judge." I stared at the blinking cursor on my computer screen, the ambient noise of the city traffic fading into absolute silence. My family was no longer just trying to steal my property. They were actively mobilizing to destroy my professional reputation, my career as an investigator, and my entire standing in the city. A standard civil lawsuit over property rights would no longer be enough to survive this. They had brought a public relations army to a contract dispute. To win, I would have to stop playing defense entirely. I needed to burn their entire fabricated world to the ground, and I needed to make sure they lit the match themselves. The surface of a lie is always smooth, but if you apply enough pressure to the right pressure points, the foundation shatters. I spent the next 48 hours submerged in the raw, unedited financial data of Willow Trace Studio, my mother's supposed interior design firm. I was looking for the exact mechanism they used to drain the property equity, but what I found was a completely different breed of betrayal. It was the first crack in the pristine, terrifying mask of my family's unified front. I was meticulously auditing the preservation cost statements submitted to the banks. On the surface, the ledger was a masterpiece of creative accounting. There were hundreds of line items for bespoke architectural salvage, imported European textiles, and specialized historical masonry consultation. But as I cross-referenced the outbound wire transfers against the registered vendor identification numbers, a glaring anomaly emerged. Every second Tuesday of the month, a massive payment was routed to a third-party vendor disguised as an antique procurement specialist. I traced the routing number attached to those specific outbound transfers. The money did not go to an antique dealer in Paris or a salvage yard in Savannah. It bypassed the commercial banking system entirely and landed in a heavily shielded, private trust account managed by a boutique wealth management firm in the Cayman Islands. I requested the formation documents for the trust through a backdoor digital registry. When the encrypted file decrypted on my screen, I did not find my father's name. I found my mother's maiden name. Celeste was not just acting as my father's willing accomplice in the grand theft of my inheritance. She was actively embezzling from the embezzlement scheme. She knew exactly how precarious their illegal house of cards was, and she had zero faith in my father's ability to keep them out of federal prison if the floor collapsed. For years, she had been quietly skimming hundreds of thousands of dollars off the top of the fraudulent loan proceeds, building a massive, untraceable escape fund. She was preparing to abandon ship, and she was doing it with the very money they had stolen from me. The realization was intoxicating. My parents were not a united, impenetrable fortress of malice. They were two seasoned grifters locked in a marriage of convenience, quietly picking each other's pockets while pretending to look in the same direction. I was still processing the magnitude of my mother's secret offshore accounts when my secure line rang. It was Talia. She did not bother with a greeting. She simply told me to open the encrypted server portal and look at the new folder she had just uploaded. Through her aggressive network of corporate litigators, Talia had managed to penetrate the firewall of the out-of-state development firm that held the secret option contract on my land. She had subpoenaed the preliminary communication logs under the guise of the Lis Pendens investigation. I opened the folder. It contained a chronological chain of private messages intercepted from a secondary, unmonitored server. The messages were between my father and a woman named Lena Crow. A quick search confirmed that Lena Crow was not a real estate developer. She was the chief executive officer of a highly aggressive, predatory private equity fund based in Chicago. She was a decade younger than my mother, possessing a lethal corporate reputation and a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars. As I read through the transcripts, the true horrifying architecture of my father's endgame came into sharp, agonizing focus. The messages were not cold. Professional negotiations about zoning laws or property boundaries. They were intimate. They were conspiratorial. My father was not just brokering a land deal. He was negotiating the total liquidation of his current life. In one specific exchange, Lena asked if the local liabilities would cause a delay in the final wire transfer. My father responded with chilling clarity. He assured her that he was in the final stages of cleaning up the membership structure of the company. He promised her that once the properties were sold and the cash was cleared through her fund, he would be on a plane to join her, leaving the local mess to burn itself out. He was not planning to save the family business. He was not planning to share the spoils of his massive fraud with my mother. He fully intended to liquidate my inheritance, wash the untraceable cash through Lena's equity fund, and completely vanish from the state. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing as the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle snapped into place. If Warren disappeared with the money, someone had to be left behind to take the fall when the state tax board and the federal banking regulators inevitably arrived to investigate the forged signatures, the fake permits, and the defaulted commercial loans. I pulled up the corporate hierarchy charts for Marsh Lantern Development. I looked at the signature lines on the environmental hazard waivers, the subcontractor liability agreements, and the municipal building permits. Mason. My older brother's signature was the only ink on the most dangerous, highly illegal documents in the entire portfolio. For my entire life, I had harbored a deep, bitter resentment toward Mason. I believed he was the golden child, the beloved heir who was endlessly protected and funded by our parents while I was left to fight for scraps. But looking at the legal structure of my father's shadow empire, I realized Mason was never the heir. Mason was the meat shield. My father had spent 34 years stroking Mason's fragile ego, funding his failed ventures, and propping up his false sense of authority for one singular, horrifying purpose. He was fattening the calf for the slaughter. When the federal indictments rained down, my father would be sipping expensive wine in a different time zone with Lena Crow, and Mason would be the one facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for criminal negligence and massive title fraud. My father had literally built a bulletproof vest out of his own son's flesh and blood. A heavy, absolute silence settled over my office. This massive double betrayal forced me to reevaluate every single childhood memory I possessed. I thought about all those nights sitting at the dining room table, listening to my mother scream until she was hoarse about my supposed failures, my lack of ambition, and my stubbornness. I remembered my father sitting at the head of the table, calmly sipping his iced tea, never raising his voice, never intervening. I used to think he was just a passive, henpecked man who hated conflict. Now, I understood the terrifying truth. He was the sniper in the watchtower. He loved the noise my mother made because it provided the perfect acoustic cover for his own silent, lethal operations in the background. He let her be the visible monster so no one would ever notice him slowly unbolting the floorboards beneath our feet. The urge to print out the offshore bank statements and the messages with Lena Crow, drive to my parents' immaculate house, and throw the papers in their faces was a burning fire in my throat. I wanted to watch the shock register in my mother's eyes when she realized she was being abandoned. I wanted to see Mason's arrogant posture crumble when he understood he was nothing more than a disposable patsy. But I forced my hands away from the keyboard. I took a long, deep breath, letting the cold air of the room extinguish the emotional fire. If I walked into a room and exposed everything at once, I would inadvertently give them a common enemy. The sheer shock of the revelation might temporarily force them back into a desperate, defensive alliance against me. They would hire a unified legal defense team, pool their remaining resources, and fight me to the bitter end in a drawn-out, agonizing trial. I picked up the phone and dialed Talia's private number. She answered on the first ring. I told her everything I had found. I detailed the offshore accounts, the embezzlement, the mistress, and the sacrificial lamb setup. When I finished, the line was quiet for a long moment. I could hear the faint sound of Talia tapping her gold pen against her mahogany desk. I did not ask for her advice. I gave her the new directive. I told her we were abandoning the traditional strategy of a frontal legal assault. We were not going to demand my property back in a clean, professional settlement. We were going to weaponize their own greed against them. My family was currently operating under the fragile delusion that they were a united front, fighting off a crazy, greedy daughter. I needed them to maintain that illusion just a little bit longer. We were going to carefully construct a trap that fed them specific, highly curated pieces of information. We would drop a hint to my mother about my father's sudden liquidity. We would let Mason catch a glimpse of the liability clauses he had blindly signed. We would let my father believe his escape route was still perfectly clear. We were not just going to reclaim the holding company. We were going to lock all three of them in a dark room with the truth, seal the exits, and wait for the screaming to start. By the time they finally realized I was the one holding the keys, they would have already torn each other to absolute shreds. Anger is a chaotic, undisciplined element. It makes you sloppy. It makes you predictable. When you are operating in the high-stakes theater of property law and corporate fraud, emotion is the absolute quickest way to lose your leverage. I did not waste a single ounce of my energy on rage. Instead of screaming, I built a structure. I transformed my dining room into a war room, covering the walls in corkboards and connecting the data points with a terrifying, clinical precision. I divided the sprawling, diseased anatomy of my family's criminal enterprise into 3 distinct operational branches: title forgery, rental income misappropriation, and electronic notary fraud. I needed bulletproof, third-party verification for the digital crimes. I reached out to a private digital forensics contractor based out of Atlanta. a man who charged $500 an hour and specialized in dismantling corporate espionage. I paid his $10,000 retainer out of my own depleted savings account. I handed him the raw audit logs from the county clerk's digital portal. I instructed him to completely reconstruct the metadata packets and login trails attached to every single fraudulent commercial loan. He did not merely confirm that the static Internet Protocol address belonged to my father's development firm. He went significantly deeper. He extracted the specific device identifiers, the router history, and the exact timestamps. He generated a massive, undeniable report proving that the documents bearing my forged digital signature were created, stamped, and submitted from a hardwired desktop cluster located inside the executive suite of my father's office. The keystrokes did not originate from my laptop. They were executed from a desk 50 miles away from my carriage house, frequently during the exact hours when my own firm's security cameras showed me sitting at my own cubicle. Branch 2 required a different kind of scalpel. I retained an independent forensic auditor, a retired Treasury agent who viewed numbers as absolute moral imperatives. We sat together in my quiet house for 4 consecutive days, surrounded by towering stacks of tax returns and property records. We meticulously cross-referenced the official income statements submitted to the state against the actual median market rates for the 3 historic properties in our specific zip code. The resulting discrepancy was not a minor clerical error or a slight miscalculation. It was a massive, gaping wound in the ledger. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been systematically siphoned off the official books over a period of 5 years. To prove exactly how the money vanished into thin air, I had to step away from the spreadsheets and do actual fieldwork. On a Tuesday night, under the heavy cover of darkness and a pouring coastal rainstorm, I drove out to the old row houses. I knocked on the peeling wooden doors of 2 long-term tenants who had lived in those units for over 15 years. At first, they were terrified to speak with me. They were deeply, fundamentally afraid of my father's quiet wrath. But after an hour of careful negotiation and promising them absolute legal immunity, they finally opened their safes. They handed me thick, manila envelopes stuffed with old receipts. I found photocopies of legitimate rent checks stapled alongside secondary, heavily backdated lease addendums. My father had actively coerced them into paying 20% of their monthly rent entirely in untraceable cash, leveraging the constant, looming threat of immediate eviction if they refused. The backdated paperwork was his crude, brutal mechanism to hide the underground cash flow from the Municipal Rent Control Board. While auditing the municipal building permits to track my brother's liability, I stumbled onto my mother's specific, highly curated brand of theft. She had always loved playing the role of the tragic, noble steward of local history. She used that manufactured reputation to heavily lobby the city council. I pulled the civic treasury records and discovered she had successfully applied for and received 3 separate municipal preservation grants. The total awarded sum was exactly $185,000. The strict legal stipulations of those grants required extensive structural masonry repair, foundation stabilization, and historical roof restoration. I pulled the subsequent city inspection logs and matched them against the vendor invoices from her interior design firm. Only 10% of the promised physical work was ever completed. She had effectively stolen taxpayer money, slapped a fresh coat of cheap paint on the front doors for the press photographs, and routed the rest of the funds directly into her offshore trust account. In a conventional war, the instinct is to drop all your bombs at once, to shock the enemy into an immediate surrender. But I was not fighting a conventional war, and I was dealing with professional manipulators. If I submitted the entire master dossier to the civil court right now, my father's high-priced defense attorneys would have several months to dissect the evidence, file endless motions to dismiss, and invent a unified, plausible defense narrative. I could not give them time to coordinate their lies, so I meticulously curated the ammunition. I handed my lawyer only the necessary foundational documents required to sustain the civil injunction and freeze the pending commercial sale. We submitted the basic title discrepancies and a small fraction of the electronic notary anomalies to the judge. I kept the offshore accounts, the mistress, the cash rent extortion, the sacrificial lamb setup, and the municipal grant fraud completely hidden in the dark. I loaded the heaviest artillery into a vault and firmly locked the door. Meanwhile, I aggressively fortified my own position. I executed a complete, ruthless overhaul of my digital security architecture. I revoked every single legacy access permission, wiped my old devices, and physically migrated the core, decrypted evidence files to a highly secure, offline legal repository located in a vault in Delaware. But I did not just build defensive walls. I dug traps. I intentionally created a series of dummy digital folders on my old, compromised cloud drive. This was the drive my family mistakenly thought they still had backdoor access to. I seeded these fake folders with vague, heavily redacted files bearing titles like settlement projections and mediation strategy. I left the digital backdoor cracked open just enough to see who would take the bait. I wanted to monitor their desperation in real time. It was past 2 o'clock in the morning. I was sitting completely alone in my dark home office. The only source of light in the entire house was the massive monitor glowing on my desk. On the screen was a sprawling interactive map of the holding company's property lines, overlaid with the intricate, sickening web of shell companies, forged deeds, and offshore wires. It looked exactly like a neon spiderweb stretched across the city grid, and I was standing dead center. I picked up my phone and dialed my lawyer's private number. When she answered, I did not sound angry. I sounded like the architect of an inevitable collapse. "I do not need them to confess to anything," I told her, my voice perfectly steady in the quiet room. "I need them to prove exactly who they are." I needed a controlled leak, a specific channel that would carry my engineered misinformation directly into the heart of their camp without leaving my fingerprints on the delivery. I chose my Aunt Clara. She possessed a fatal combination of genuine concern and an absolute inability to keep a secret. On a Tuesday evening, I sat at my kitchen island, stared at the blank wall, and dialed her number. When she answered, I intentionally let my breathing sound shallow. I pitched my voice a half octave higher, simulating the ragged edge of total exhaustion. I confessed that the legal pressure was tearing me apart. Then, I casually dropped the bait. I told her that while my attorneys possessed the bulk of the digital files, I had recently uncovered one final devastating document hidden in my grandmother's old cedar chest. I described it as a hand-notarized, original corporate resolution that explicitly predated all of the fraudulent commercial loans. I told Clara I was terrified of what it meant, and because of that fear, I had not handed it over to the lawyers yet. I claimed it was sitting in a sealed manila envelope, which I intended to bring to a private, family-only mediation that upcoming weekend. I wanted to see if we could resolve things privately before I submitted the final, lethal piece of evidence to the court. It took exactly 45 minutes for that carefully crafted lie to reach my parents. Mason was the first to strike the bait. By 8 o'clock the next morning, my cell phone vibrated across my desk. I let it ring 4 times before answering. He did not yell. He did not accuse. He adopted the patronizing, overly calm tone of an older brother trying to talk a jumper off a ledge. He asked about my schedule for the week. He asked if I was keeping the envelope in a safe place. He repeatedly emphasized that the entire family was simply exhausted, that the fighting had gone too far, and that they just wanted to sit down and talk civilly, without the lawyers breathing down our necks. He was completely terrified. He knew that an original, hand-notarized document would instantly invalidate all the digital forgeries bearing his name as the site manager. He was probing for weakness, desperate to snatch the physical paper before the legal system ever saw it. My mother pivoted with the terrifying, fluid grace of a seasoned predator. The aggressive, gaslighting text messages ceased entirely. In their place arrived a massive, sprawling arrangement of expensive white lilies, delivered directly to my office reception desk by a uniformed courier. The scent was overpowering, sickly sweet, and funeral-like. Tucked inside the pristine petals was a heavy, cream-colored card covered in her elegant, looping cursive. She wrote a sprawling paragraph about a summer vacation we took to the coast when I was 10 years old. She reminisced about how we used to collect seashells on the beach and how much she missed her sweet, understanding little girl. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking. She was attempting to resuscitate the ghost of my childhood obedience. She genuinely believed that if she poured enough artificial sugar over the situation, if she played the role of the wounded but loving matriarch, I would simply hand over the envelope and revert back to the compliant, easily managed daughter she had designed me to be. My father, entirely predictably, ignored the emotional theater and focused exclusively on the structural logistics of the trap. He sent a formal email late Wednesday night, agreeing to sit at the table for a private mediation on Saturday afternoon. However, he insisted the meeting take place at the downtown executive offices of his primary lobbying associate. He claimed it was neutral ground, a professional courtesy. I knew exactly what it was. It was a highly controlled environment. He wanted to dictate the seating arrangement, monitor the exits, and ensure there were no recording devices hidden in the room. He wanted the home field advantage to legally and psychologically bully me into handing over the physical document before I could realize its true destructive value. I replied to his email within 10 minutes and agreed to the location without a single argument. It was a calculated, necessary concession. By yielding on the venue, I deliberately gave him the illusion of total control. I needed them to believe that despite my initial shocking rebellion at the birthday brunch, I was still fundamentally inexperienced and highly susceptible to their coordinated warfare. I wanted them to walk into that boardroom feeling dangerously overconfident, believing they had successfully backed a naive girl into a corner. While my family was busy agonizing over a phantom envelope and patting themselves on the back for securing the venue, Talia was quietly assembling a firing squad. This was never going to be a simple family chat. She spent the entire week coordinating with the heavy artillery of the state regulatory system. She contacted the county recorder's fraud division, utilizing her extensive network to bypass the usual bureaucratic delays. She reached out to the elite investigative unit of the primary title insurance underwriter that insured the properties. She even secured a commitment from a senior inspector at the State Financial Oversight Board. Talia arranged for all of them to be present in the building on Saturday afternoon. They were scheduled to wait in a separate, vacant holding room just down the hall from our designated mediation suite. They were not there to arrest anyone immediately. They were there to act as the ultimate, undeniable witnesses to the collapse. They were the absolute guarantee that once the truth came out, my family could never put the toothpaste back in the tube. The final, exquisite piece of leverage arrived on Thursday morning, completely unprompted. I was backing my car out of my driveway when Mrs. Gable, my vigilant neighbor, marched across her lawn and waved me down. She leaned heavily on her silver cane, tapped on my car window, and handed me a small black flash drive. She explained that her grandson had visited the night before and helped her pull the high-definition footage from her new porch security camera, the one she had proudly installed just 3 days before my birthday. I drove straight to my office, locked the door, and plugged the drive into my laptop. The video feed was crystal clear. It showed my brother Mason walking up my driveway in broad daylight, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man holding the forged power of attorney. But the truly devastating element was the crisp, perfectly recorded audio. The camera microphone captured Mason holding his cell phone to his ear, loudly and frantically complaining to my mother that the blue box was not in the office and the lock had been changed. He was directly, undeniably implicating her in the conspiracy right at my front gate. I watched the footage 3 times, a cold, dark satisfaction settling deeply into my bones. The trap was perfectly set, the bait was fully swallowed, and the walls were rapidly closing in. But the true beauty of the strategy was not the external pressure I was applying. It was the internal rot they had created themselves. My family was no longer simply terrified of losing their stolen millions or facing a judge. Thanks to the carefully seeded leaks and the looming threat of the original resolution, they were now fundamentally terrified of each other. My father knew my mother had offshore accounts she was hiding. My mother knew my father had a mistress and a secret exit plan. Mason was slowly realizing he was the designated scapegoat for the entire operation. They were all walking into that mediation room hyper-aware that the absolute first person to flip would be the only one to survive the impending legal massacre. The Dirty Alliance was violently cracking under the immense weight of its own greed. They were ready to tear each other's throats out before I even opened my mouth. I just had to provide the spark. The mediation was scheduled for Monday afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock. My father had selected a massive glass-walled conference room on the top floor of a downtown corporate tower, a space that offered a sweeping panoramic view of the harbor. The location was a deliberate, highly calculated tactical choice. He believed the sheer weight of the expensive architecture, the leather chairs, and the quiet hum of wealth would intimidate me into submission. He wanted to re-establish his psychological dominance before anyone even spoke a single word. I arrived exactly on time. When I opened the heavy wooden doors, the tableau was already perfectly arranged. My mother sat on the right side of the sprawling mahogany table, draped in a flawless beige silk blouse, projecting the wounded, noble aura of a matriarch who had been profoundly betrayed by her own flesh and blood. Across from her, my brother slouched in his chair, his leg bouncing with the exact same frantic energy he had displayed at the café. He looked exhausted, irritable, and deeply afraid. At the head of the table sat my father. He was unnervingly calm, his posture relaxed, his hands steepled beneath his chin like a chess grandmaster who already knew the final checkmate was entirely inevitable. I did not bring a lawyer. Talia and the regulatory agents were already waiting in a sealed, unlisted holding room 3 floors below us, exactly as we had planned. I walked to the opposite end of the table and sat down. I placed 2 manila file folders onto the polished wood. They were intentionally thin. I watched the collective shift in their body language. The tension in Mason's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. My father's eyes flicked to the folders, and a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of his mouth. They had spent the entire weekend terrified that I possessed a mountain of undeniable, original evidence. Seeing only a few dozen pages convinced them that I was bluffing, that I had only uncovered the absolute surface of their operation. My father initiated the engagement using his standard, velvet-wrapped hammer. He leaned forward, his voice maintaining a low, soothing baritone. He began by framing my legal actions as a drastic, extreme overreaction to a simple administrative oversight. He reminded me of the roof they had kept over my head, the education they had supposedly funded, and the heavy burden of the family legacy. He spoke of honor. He stated that dragging this internal misunderstanding through a public civil court would permanently destroy the family name and ruin any chance of a peaceful reconciliation. My mother seamlessly picked up the baton. She pressed a tissue to the corner of her dry eye and whispered that she simply could not understand why I was trying to hurt them so deeply. She asked where her sweet, reasonable daughter had gone. I let them perform. I did not interrupt. I did not argue. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with the unsaid accusations and the suffocating pressure of their unified front. When they finally exhausted their rehearsed guilt trips, my father executed his final move. He reached into his leather briefcase and slid a heavy bound document across the smooth surface of the table. He offered a settlement that, on the surface, appeared incredibly generous. He proposed a direct, immediate wire transfer of $750,000 into my personal checking account. Furthermore, he would officially sign over the deed to my carriage house, removing any fabricated claims of guardianship. In exchange, I only needed to do 2 things: withdraw the pending legal block on the historic properties and sign a retroactive, legally binding confirmation that all previous corporate transfers and commercial loans had been executed with my full, voluntary consent. It was a bribe disguised as an olive branch. It was hush money. I did not look at the document. I looked at my mother. The second my father said the words, $750,000, her perfect, wounded mask violently fractured. Her posture stiffened. Her eyes darted toward him, wide and filled with sudden, absolute shock. She had not known. She had been secretly skimming money into offshore accounts for years, because she believed the holding company was tightly leveraged and cash poor. Hearing her husband casually offer nearly $1 million in liquid capital to make a problem disappear shattered her reality. It was a massive, glaring signal that he was hiding a private slush fund far larger than her own, and that he was making unilateral financial decisions without consulting his supposed partner in crime. The invisible crack between them just widened into a canyon. I rested my hands on top of the thin folders. I casually mentioned that a settlement might be complicated by the liabilities. I kept my voice soft, conversational. I noted that I would need to carefully consider the legal exposure, especially since a neighbor had recently handed me high-definition security footage of the attempted break-in at my gate. I added, almost as an afterthought, that the state might ask uncomfortable questions about why the electronic notary logs for the commercial loans mapped perfectly to a specific fiber optic cluster in a certain executive suite. Mason snapped. He slammed both of his hands onto the mahogany table, the loud crack echoing off the glass walls. He leaned over the table, his face flushed dark red, a vein pulsing wildly in his neck. He demanded that I stop speaking in riddles. He accused me of wearing a wire, of trying to trap him, of being entirely obsessed with destroying his life over a few pieces of paper. He was a cornered animal, fully aware that the walls were closing in, but still completely blind to who was actually holding the cage. My father shot Mason a chilling, silencing glare, attempting to regain control of the room. He turned back to me, tapping his heavy gold pen against the settlement contract. He told me I had a choice to make right now. I could take the money in the house and walk away wealthy, or I could leave the room with nothing and spend the next decade drowning in legal fees. The air in the room was pulled tight, vibrating like a piano wire stretched to the absolute breaking point. I looked down at the settlement offer. I reached out and slowly pushed it back across the table, away from me. I closed the cover of my thin file folder. I looked at my brother, whose chest was heaving with panic. I looked at my mother, whose eyes were still fixed on my father with a new, venomous suspicion. And finally, I looked at my father, whose confident smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, hard calculation. I folded my hands together. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of any anger or sorrow. I told them that before I even considered signing my name to another piece of paper. I wanted to clear the air with the truth. I placed my tablet in the center of the table and pressed play. The high-definition footage from my neighbor's porch camera filled the silent room. There was Mason, standing on my driveway in broad daylight next to the locksmith. The audio was crisp and undeniable. Mason's voice echoed off the glass walls, frantic and loud, telling our mother over the phone that the deadbolt was drilled, but the blue box was completely missing from my home office. Celeste lunged forward, her pristine mask slipping into an ugly, desperate snarl. She immediately turned her venom toward Mason, her mouth opening to undoubtedly throw her own son under the bus for botching the physical break-in. I did not give her the chance to draw a single breath or spin a single lie. I pulled a printed spreadsheet from the folder and placed it directly in front of her. It was the financial routing analysis of Willow Trace Studio. I kept my voice perfectly flat and clinical. I explained, in agonizing detail, the exact offshore trust account registered in the Cayman Islands under her maiden name. I read the total balance aloud. It was a staggering sum, built entirely from the municipal preservation grants she had stolen and the fraudulent commercial loan proceeds she had skimmed off the top for the past 5 years. Warren physically recoiled. His head snapped toward his wife. The shock on his face was entirely genuine. He had tightly controlled every aspect of his shadow empire, believing he was the sole architect of the grand fraud. Discovering that his subservient, status-obsessed wife had been silently robbing him blind for half a decade broke his aristocratic composure entirely. He slammed his fist on the table, his heavy gold watch clattering against the wood, and opened his mouth to tear into her. I cut him off with the second piece of paper. I slid the intercepted email thread across the polished wood. Stopping it right under his steepled hands, I did not yell. I simply introduced Lena Crow to the room. I read the highlighted section of his message, the one where he explicitly promised the private equity manager that he was finalizing the quiet liquidation of the historic properties, and that he would be on a plane to Chicago with the untraceable cash by the end of the quarter. I then placed the geolocation audit logs next to the emails, proving unequivocally that the electronic notary seals for every single fraudulent commercial loan were executed directly from his specific executive desk. The silence that followed was not the quiet of a peaceful room. It was the vacuum of space right before a star goes supernova. The illusion of the United Bennett family evaporated into thin air. Celeste shrieked. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure outrage. She realized in a fraction of a second that her husband was never planning to take her with him. She was the designated local scapegoat, meant to be left behind with the empty bank accounts, the angry creditors, and the collapsing lies. Warren roared back, his calm, baritone facade entirely shattered. He cursed her for the secret offshore trust, his face purple with rage, completely abandoning his polite, Southern gentleman persona. And then there was Mason. My golden brother looked at the internet protocol logs from our father's office. He looked at the printed emails discussing the impending out-of-state fire sale. And finally, his eyes dropped to the liability waivers and building permits he had blindly signed for the past 4 years. The color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse. He realized, with a horrifying, absolute certainty, that he was never the beloved heir. His name was on every single piece of dirty paper. When the commercial developer took the land and Warren vanished to Chicago, Mason was the only one going to federal prison. He was nothing but a human meat shield. They erupted. The three of them began screaming at each other, their voices bouncing violently off the panoramic glass windows. They hurled wild accusations, threatened immediate lawsuits, and exposed years of petty, vicious lies in a desperate, animalistic scramble to save themselves. They were completely tearing each other apart. I sat back in my leather chair and watched them bleed. When the shouting reached a deafening crescendo, I reached into the second folder. I pulled out the final, heaviest document. I slammed it down onto the table. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, slicing right through their screaming match. They froze, chests heaving, and looked at the thick parchment. It was my grandmother's handwritten codicil, attached to a flawless, unbroken chain of legal custody and forensic authentication. I looked into my father's panicked eyes and explained the reality of his situation. I was the legal, controlling member of Bennett Row Holdings from the exact moment June passed away. That meant every single commercial mortgage, every forged deed, and every fraudulent development permit they had filed over the last 4 years was entirely void. It was not a civil family dispute. It was a massive, multi-million-dollar federal fraud. My father opened his mouth, perhaps to offer another bribe, perhaps to beg. He never got the chance. The heavy wooden doors of the conference room swung open. Talia Mercer walked in. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. She did not look at my parents. She simply stepped aside and held the door wide open. A procession of severe, silent professionals filed into the room. There was the senior representative from the county recorder's office. Next came the lead investigator for the primary title insurance underwriter. Behind him was the state financial inspector, and finally, a stern-faced detective from the municipal property fraud division. There were no dramatic handcuffs. There were no shouting police officers throwing my family against the glass walls. That is television. Real destruction is quiet, bureaucratic, and entirely inescapable. The true punishment arrived right then, in the suffocating realization that they were no longer dealing with a daughter they could manipulate or gaslight. They were suddenly standing face to face with the crushing, relentless weight of the legal system I had meticulously invited into the room. The trap had permanently locked. I did not stay to watch the state inspectors begin their interrogations. I stood up, buttoned my blazer, and walked out of the conference room without saying a single goodbye. In the weeks that followed, the Bennett family empire was dismantled with surgical precision. I officially reclaimed my legal 51% controlling interest in Bennett Row Holdings. I immediately filed an emergency injunction that blocked the secret option contract with the Chicago developer, saving the historic block from the wrecking ball. I placed the three properties into an independent, court-appointed receivership to restructure the massive, fraudulent debts my father had accumulated, ensuring the long-term tenants were protected from eviction. Mason, utterly terrified of facing decades behind bars for the environmental and safety permits bearing his signature, immediately turned state's witness. He traded his absolute loyalty for a plea deal, handing the investigators every remaining password and locked filing cabinet in my father's office. Warren and Celeste were left facing an avalanche of state and federal indictments. Their marriage dissolved into a bitter, endless legal war over whatever assets the government had not already frozen. But the financial and legal victories were secondary. The true triumph hit me the moment I stepped out of that corporate tower and walked onto the sunlit streets of Charleston. The coastal breeze carried the scent of salt and blooming jasmine. For the first time in 34 years, my chest felt completely light. I was no longer the difficult child desperately trying to explain myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. I was the only person in my bloodline who had possessed the courage to tell the truth so loudly that absolutely no one could cover my mouth again. In an ancient, moss-draped city, where everyone constantly whispers about bloodlines, inherited legacy, and family reputation, I had chosen the only thing that actually matters. I chose the fundamental right to live a life that was no longer written for me on forged, suffocating paper by the people who were supposed to love me. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please drop a comment below and let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to Violet Revenge Stories, like this video, and support the channel even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.